Hi, I'm Gareth Green. Keyboard harmony. Is it something we need to bother with, or should we just forget it and get on with learning some new pieces or something? After all, that's what most people want to do, isn't it? Well, yes, if you are an improviser, keyboard harmony is something you definitely need. So if you're a jazzer wanting to improvise, actually knowing where your chords are, knowing where your fingers need to go, pretty essential. If you've got a background like mine, where you've worked in churches and cathedrals as an organist, you need to improvise. If you're a pianist, you might think, well, when do I ever need to improvise or do any of those things? Maybe you can go through life not having to worry about it. I'll tell you one thing though, people who are good at keyboard harmony are usually much better at all sorts of other things. For example, they're better sight readers. People who can do keyboard harmony are usually much more tuned into what's happening in the harmony, what's happening in the textures of music that they're playing, you know, exactly what is melodic material, what is kind of harmonic filling material that enables you to think about what needs a bit of focus in the tone and the balance, all these kind of things. So it's very much a musical skill that enhances what you're doing as a performer. If you're a composer, well, you can sit and think, well, this chord fits with that note, and then I've got another note and this chord fits with that, and you can do it entirely mechanically. But is it going to give you the best musical result? Probably not. Whereas actually, if you can kind of noodle about on the keys and find your way from one chord to another, that's really going to give you a greater facility. It's the whole aural thing that comes with it as well. As you do your harmony under your fingers, rather than just as dots on a page, you get to hear the sound, you get familiar with the sound, then you start to think, actually, I know what that chord is, I can hear it, and I know what it is. Or you can read a piece of music and think, I don't have to play that to know what it sounds like. So there are many advantages in doing keyboard harmony, as well as the kind of related things about, you know, you're accompanying a singer, the song's too high, can you transpose it down for me? Yeah, sure, I can play that in D instead of in E. So being able to do all these tricks actually is a useful thing that liberates musicians, whether you're performers or composers. So I think it's well worth the effort. Now, some of you are going to say, the trouble is I don't play the piano or the keyboard. Well, that is a slight difficulty. But a lot of people who play the flute or the trumpet actually can get their fingers around the keys and do a bit of piano or keyboard playing. You don't have to be the world's greatest pianist to do this. It's still a useful thing to be able to do. But if you are a keyboard player, well, you've got everything you need in terms of keyboard facility to be able to do this. So let me just sort of flag up some of the key things that you might want to do in keyboard harmony. Obviously this, finding triads in major and minor keys. So if you're in a major key, well, what are the triads in that key? Well, okay, it's fairly easy to find those triads, but just being very quick to know what they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, I can do that in C major. Can I do it in A flat major? Can I do it in C sharp major? Can I think major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished? You know, am I familiar with all that stuff? If I'm in a minor key, you know, minor, diminished, augmented, minor, major, major, diminished. Or if I'm using a different form of the minor scale, well, what differences does that make? So getting round all these triads in major and minor keys, knowing where they are, is a real useful basis for keyboard harmony. Next step, converting those triads into chords. Now, how do I take a triad and actually turn it into a chord that's got 6 notes or 4 notes or 3 notes? And how do I kind of space these things? Which notes do I put in the left hand? Which notes do I put in the right hand? You know, how do I go about all of that? So that's a useful next step. Then we need to know something about, well, what are the basic chords, you know, the ones we've just talked about as triads? How do we kind of get a facility for using those basic chords? And furthermore, basic chord progressions, i.e. how do we move from this chord to that chord, or which are the best chords to follow which other chords, so we kind of get some seamless approach to things that work. So we're not going from one chord to another thinking, ooh, that sounded a bit odd or a bit clunky. If I go from that chord to this chord instead, sounds a lot better. So, you know, just kind of getting our heads around that kind of musical language stuff. Cadences. So when you come to the end of a phrase, you generally speaking need a cadence. So do we know our cadences? What are they? What are the chords in different keys? How do I find those chords quickly? How do I find those chords with different kinds of melody notes going on? So I can just have a facility in dealing with cadences. So just sitting at the keyboard, practicing cadences in different keys, absolutely important thing to do. Then, of course, there are loads of things to avoid. So just kind of thinking, actually, have I got an idea about what are the things that actually are going to impair what I'm doing? So do I know how to avoid those? I won't go into the detail of that, but there is a kind of little body of knowledge of things to avoid. Okay, how to add chords to melodies. You know, lots of people, I've got a great tune, don't know which chords to put with it. Or the other way around, I've got this amazing chord scheme. How do I kind of compose a melody that goes with that? So in other words, how do we get chord language and melodic language to speak to each other? Which comes first, the melody or the chords? Could be either, but how do I deal with that both ways? Then using inversion chords. Loads of people, when they're doing the keyboard harmony, when they're writing harmony, often just use chords in root position. But of course we can use chords in first inversion or second inversion. We can use third inversion or more if we're using extended chords. But when do I use a root position chord? When do I use an inversion chord? What's the difference? Why does one help the other? All that kind of stuff. What about using common chords and less common chords? Do I spend my whole life just going around the same loop, 1, 4, 5? Or do I think, oh, actually, I could have a chord 3 in here. That would be something a bit different. Am I allowed to do that? Yes, but what are the circumstances in which it's best to use them? Things like this. So how do we kind of extend the kind of chord choice we're using, and how do we blend common chords with less common chords and make that effective? What about changing key? You know, do we write a piece of music that's all in the same key from start to finish? Bit boring. Or how do we get from this key to that key? Conventionally, we use something called a pivot chord, a chord that belongs to the key you're leaving and to the key that you're joining. So how can I organize that? Which keys go to which other keys? How do I use pivot chords? How do I make these modulations, these key changes really effective? Extended chords. If you can do your basic chords, well, can we now think about sevenths, ninths, 11ths and 13ths? If you're a jazzer, you definitely need to know about that stuff. But even if you're not, it's good to know about those. So when you're composing, you've got a richer diet of chords you can use. When you're playing something, instead of looking at a chord thinking, help, what's that? If you kind of think, oh, actually, that is a dominant 13th chord. So great, it helps you read it and learn it quicker. What about all these funny things? Chromatic chords, you know, chords that enhance what we're doing harmonically, sometimes using notes that don't belong to the key that you're in, but give us a better colour. Diminished seventh chords, Neapolitan chords, Italian, French and German 6. You know, all these things that add a bit of colour, these what we call chromatic chords. Slightly take us by surprise, but they flow in alongside chords that do belong to the key. Do we know what all these things are? Can we find them in different keys? Do we know how to approach them? Do we know how to resolve them? That's all good stuff to know. Exploring more complicated keys, because a lot of people just sort of spend their lives in C major, possibly an A minor or something. Some people brave out into, you know, keys with 1 sharp, 1 flat, 2 sharps, 2 flats. But what about C sharp major, C flat major, A flat minor, you know, all these kind of keys? Can we deal in those as well? Because it's great to be liberated to work in all the keys. And then once you've got all this stuff going, you know, how do you actually add musical character to your keyboard harmony? You don't want something that just sounds like a load of chords, but could you do... particular style, but can you do something that actually makes it sound like a piece of music? So we're dealing with chord progressions, but we're trying to make it as expressive as we can. Well, if you're thinking, yeah, actually I could do with working on this agenda, this is the agenda that we're covering in our keyboard harmony course at www.mmcourses.co.uk. UK. So you might want to have a look at that and see if this is something that's useful to you. We've got lots of videos on the channel that are all one-off videos. So you might find something on harmony or keyboard harmony and think, oh, that's a useful little trick. But if you want to have a kind of A to Z structured course that's taking you logically through the whole thing from one place to another, that is what our keyboard harmony course delivers. So have a look at it. Scroll down underneath the description. It will list everything that's on the course. You can see how long the videos are. Very practical. You can see me playing, the notes light up. You can hear everything that's going on. You can pause whenever you want, try stuff out yourself. And actually lots of people told us this has been a real liberation point because you can read about it in books. Actually doing it under your fingers is what matters. So keyboard harmony course, www.mmcourses.co.uk.